I thought it was important to think about the intellectual project of what this exhibition is. And so it comes from a poem, the first line of Amanda Gorman's poem, Ship's Manifest, which is a work about, working through trauma rather than avoiding it. And so I just wanted to thank you, Zoe, for bringing it all together. And especially while we're working through and thinking about these works, to keep your prompt in mind. And so the last line, or among the last lines in the exhibition text, is that a main thread that convenes many of these artists is that not only do they work through trauma, but they're constructing histories in a way that releases them from a kind of traumatic past. And so how do we reconstruct history in order to care for our own communities? And so with that, I'll pass it over to my partner, Dr. Jefferson and Trina.
And we're going to begin by just allowing each of us to take stock of the magnitude of these works. And so Matt and I thought it would be important, if you can, if we talk. I don't think any of us would be offended if you moved as close to the works as the museum allows, so that you can really see, don't touch. But move as close to the works as you can, because the reason we wanted to start this way is because one of the things that strikes us about these works is just how brilliant they are and the labor that has created them. And so we're going to talk about high-level concepts of memory and archival work. We're going to talk about what it means to work through trauma as one who is so close to the trauma. We're going to talk about all of that. Work felt familiar to me. I grew up in rural South Carolina, right next to a bunch of cornfields and wheat fields and the like, and this work, upon seeing it, just reminded me of home. And the elements of this work, when you read the curator notes and you read Trina's telling of this work, really just took me home. Took me home to the American South, a place that's full of troubled histories and memories. And this work, and all of its beauty, is about that troubled history. And it begins with the material that makes up this work. And so we just wanted to give Trina a moment to talk through and to draw your attention to the elements of this work. And in doing so, taking you where she took me, back to the history of the American South with all of its troubled past. But as people in the South still think, with all of its beautiful promise and the future. And so Trina, if you can just tell us about the material in this piece and where these materials are from that comprise it.
Thank you, Hakeem. That was wonderful. Thank you for that. So the focus of my art practice is primarily on materiality. I had a whole other career before I became an artist, and I realized I was only able, when I started learning about my family history, I was only able to truly process it with by exploring, by touching, by seeing, by tasting things related to my ancestors, because there were no family stories. And this is the piece that pretty much that started it all, and continues to actually dominate and guide me in every way. It's completely focused, the materials drive it. So it's called Liberation Through Redaction. And the piece started when I remember in grad school, and my work focuses on migration, memory and migration. And I was doing a lot of talk and work talking about my enslaved ancestors. They also wanted to talk about the migration stories. And this one teacher told me, you know what, we don't want to hear about the migration stories, focus on slavery. That will be better in the market, in the art market. And I was just like, no, that's not why I went to grad school in my 40s. I want to dig deeper. I want to know who they are and where they went, and then where they are now and in the future, like migration. And she's like, no. We want the slaves with the stories of enslavement. So I was like, okay, you want slavery? I'll give you slavery. So this piece is, it's based on a document. It is a document, a copy of an 1835 will documenting one of the owners of my ancestors, one of the enslavers, I should say, when he was going to free all of his enslaved people, mostly my ancestors, and it also includes, everything else in his house and whatnot. So I took that document, and I had come across, and I can go into that story, but a big, like a 10-pound bag of cotton, and I ended up making paper out of that 10-pound bag of cotton, making my own paper, very laborious process, which includes cooking, using a Hollander beater, like pulling seeds from the cotton bolls, which was a very emotional process. And then I made the paper.
Before the cotton pit, they would have to pluck the seeds from the cotton by hand. And one of the things we talked about is this childhood memory that I had of going to a museum in South Carolina and having where they brought the cotton with the, what are they called? The bolls? Still in them, and you pluck them out. And one of the things you can feel it, a very tactile experience. And Trina was doing this by hand, processing and cleaning the cotton by hand.
And when I was doing that, I started late doing this in terms of trying to get the project completed. And so I had to do it fast. I had to do it really fast to catch up on my timelines. I was trying to do as much as I could. So 3 days into it, and like my hands were getting sore and dry, and that's it. That was the whole piece in that moment, was when I realized, oh my God, like I had a self-imposed deadline that I was trying to meet, but can you imagine if you had to produce a certain amount in one day? And so that I had to stop for a little bit, and then but that literally was the piece right there. It took a long time, so taking out the seeds and cooking it for hours, and you can either use lye or soda ash. I chose soda ash because I have a family history of straightening my hair with lye. I did not want to recreate. And then it's a long, laborious process. So then I made the paper. The next step it's an intaglio print. So the intaglio it's an etching process. And I wanted to do an etching process because I wanted to use it as a form of mark making for the text. So it's no longer, this history that was lost would no longer be lost. Again, a form of mark making. And this ink I made the ink using a bone black dry pigment because I wanted a life force in the ink. I used soil from Senegal that I collected when I took a trip there, connected to my ancestry, people who had it was a group trip. We had taken DNA tests, and we wanted to trace our ancestry, go to where our ancestors were from. And cedar I collected on the border of Senegal and the Gambia, so that's the ink. So the thread, I redacted it. It's called Liberation through Redaction. I redact every word that has nothing to do with my ancestors' humanity, so there's not that much left, except for words like the man Martin Free, who is my third-time great-grandfather. That is redacted with this sisal that I did I embroidered as a back stitch, and I dyed that with hibiscus flower that I collected in Senegal to represent the blood and DNA of my ancestors. And I was told, somebody was like, make this easier, just use, a lot of people when they're embroidering paper, they take like a mini hole punch so they can have nice clean embroidery moments, and I wanted that violence. I wanted to have that violent tear using, I call it like the Center for Needlework, I forgot what it was, the exact name, but they told me the type of needle I should use for paper, and I got that needle, and I noticed as I was going, sometimes it was super smooth and perfect, and other times, like in moments here, it would bunch and get tight and pull and tear. And I recognize in those moments is like when you realize you can't fight the material, it's doing something, it's guiding you, you work with that. And it was lovely because that's when I was like, that was the battle right there. Sometimes things are nice and smooth, but then that fight gets really nasty. And I wanted to show that violence.
Yeah, one of the things that we'll talk a lot about is this practice of doing this work and what it means to have done this work on this subject. But before we move over to Tricia's piece, one of the things I just wanted to point out that we talked about Trina and me can talk about it more when we all sit down. And when you have a chance, I really invite you to see it up close, to see the way that the threading really breaks through the paper. And it's an image, as I mentioned to Trina at our studio visit, when you think about just the sort of holes and scrapes that it makes on the paper, there are very famous images of enslaved people who were brutalized in periods of enslavement. And we've all seen these pictures of the backs of these welts. And the violence that Trina talks about and doing the sort of weaving just brings that sort of recollection to mind. And so as we sit and talk more after we talk about Tricia's piece, one of the things I'm eager to hear more about is this exercise of doing this really hard work, being so close to the subject. Your great-grandfather, Bryce removed William. But thank you, Trina. Let's make our way over this way to see Tricia's piece before we sit down.
Hello everyone. Hi, I'm Tricia Rainwater. This is my piece, Falamba Ishla Chiki, which means to call back two or more people. The piece is about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It's an ongoing crisis, not just in Indian country, not just on reservations, but all over the United States and further. Indigenous women and femmes are treated really poorly by society, often disposed of. I think a lot about this quote by this author I love, Tricia Rainwater, about no one caring about a Native woman walking down the highway. No one asks where she's going. But when you look at statistics, Native women and femmes are often said that they die of exposure at rest stops and on the side of the road. But those things need to be linked, so we should be thinking about that as a society. These two pieces were created for this installation with hand-dyed fabric, with jingles attached to the top. These are baby jingles, and at the bottom, adult jingles to represent child to adult being murdered and going missing. The piece is meant to be moved and touched, and really the sound is to draw back, to call back, to remind people that we're still looking for them and hoping they return. The two mobiles are nested upon a wall of missing posters that I've been collecting for the past few years. I think it's really interesting when we look at the posters and we take in every single individual on the wall. There's some things I want to point out. The ages span from very young to elderly. And one woman in particular, Liza Maris, I'll talk about, she went missing in, I'm going to take a breath. She went missing in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And Ardmore, Oklahoma is one of the ends of the Trail of Tears for Choctaw people. Choctaw people were brought to Ardmore, locked in a warehouse, and left to die. So to have a young woman still missing on this wall at one of the ends of the Trail of Tears just speaks to this epidemic still going on and needing to be talked about. You hear my voice over the loudspeaker, and I'm saying each individual on the wall's name and calling them back. Really an incantation, a prayer, an offering to have them come back and hear that we're still hoping we find them.
Thank you, Tricia. I also wanted to point out that when I first saw this, there is this kind of quote that a poet named Natalie Diaz reminds me of. That she's a poet who is Mojave descent, and she has an amazing book called Post-Colonial Love Poems. But there's something very, very disorienting about the beauty and lyricism, because she talks about desire and sensuality, right? And so I found this incredibly sprawling, and the tension with knowing your work Tricia, you have been doing self-portraiture and doing these very intimate images of yourself. And this was one of the most expansive, monumental works. And I thought this tension between desire and trauma, and in a way, Natalie's work teaches me that a part of like desire is it becomes a vehicle for working through trauma. And so I wanted to, I think you hit every single technical component, but I think a really important thing to talk about is the labor, to pick up on Hakeem's note of making the work in your studio and the significance of the color technique of the ribbons.
Yeah, I will say, so I hand dyed all of the fabric, hand tore it, cut it to size. And then jingle crimping is quite a process used in regalia. And my arm started to go very numb halfway through. I was thinking about Trina's process and mine and like the labor involved. Also, there was this very jarring part of dyeing the fabric where my hands started to turn this very red. I had suffered a really big loss a few years ago of my friend being murdered on the reservation I grew up on. And so this grappling with the tension of the color of my hands now, how I'm implicated when I'm silent, and how I speak up and leverage my privilege as a person with all of my privilege.
Well, I think from this point on, now that we have seen the work up close, we can move into seating, and then we'll have more of a dynamic cross dialogue between the boards.
And as we walk through our conversation tonight, Matt and I want to be really attentive to the closeness with which you two sort of move through this work. But one of the things that Matt and I have been thinking and talking a lot about, and our excitement for being in conversation with the two of you, is because we know that you two have been in constant conversation with one another, both as artists in the show, but also your works across the gallery. And so we were eager to hear you say a little bit more about maybe what it means, not just to be in conversation with each other tonight, but to have your works in such conversation with each other.
Thank you for that question. The fact that our work is positioned as it has been, it makes me very grateful that when people come into this space, they're able to kind of catch the energy and feel the conversation that they're both having, because it's not just the materiality. Well, the materiality is resurrecting or reviving the stories of the people that the pieces are about. It's giving them a voice, and I want people to be able to. I'm hoping that people are able to catch that energy and recognize and feel the history of the people that these two pieces are representing, and the fact that they're captured on either side, and they're in the middle. It's just the positioning is fantastic.
I just want to say I discovered Trina's work, was it 2 years ago? I think I cold messaged her on Instagram and was like, oh my gosh, I saw your work at Minnesota Street tonight. I am so amazed and I'm overwhelmed, and I'm making similar work, I think, and I'd love to meet you. And she was so generous. Miss Miranda. And I remember just feeling like I really wanted to be in a show with her. And so when Zoe and I met, and there was whispers about asking Trina, and maybe she'd accept, I was like, oh my God, this is the dream. There are artists you really want to show with, and she definitely was one. So this opportunity for our work to mirror each other and to be in conversation with each other. We were installing at the same time, and both really paying close attention to our pieces, so it feels very connected.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had created the work in conversation, like you were developing together, right? So One of the things that we wanted to focus on for the beginning was just the very close attention that you pay to materials, because Tricia, you were using berry dye, and you're dip dyeing each of these ribbons, which represents bodies, and then similarly, Trina, you were using hibiscus from Senegal to make your own thread and threading them through. So I was just very struck that these ideas of bloodline, the ideas, the kinds of motifs that you draw upon were so much in conversation. And so another thread that I also found was that these are histories of what we consider as the American South. So I wanted to ask about your relationship to land and place and how you intervene in that landscape. And this is sort of kicking, maybe I want to hear from you, Tricia, to talk about your photography and how you intervene with the landscape.
So I've been a self-portrait photographer for over a decade, photographing my body as a trauma survivor. I'm the daughter of a Native man who was very active in the American Indian movement and other movements. I began self-portrait photography as a way to survive my abuse and to see myself reflected. You don't see bodies like mine and people's stories like mine told. And so it felt very important to take up space in the camera, in my home, in nature. And it became very much connected to nature over the past, at the beginning of the pandemic, truly. I began to wander into Golden Gate Park and take photos of myself nestled in nature. I was raised on a reservation that is not my own, and so I never fit. I was always this mixed kid kind of looking for a place to belong. And so place and home has never felt quite like it was mine. But I traveled the Choctaw route of the Trail of Tears from Louisiana 2 years ago now, and it was the first time I was like, oh my gosh, this feeling, this overwhelming knowing where I am, and very clearly being spoken to about what I should do, how I should make my work. And I think that comes through in this work as well, really checking in with myself and my Indigenous community and kin about how I should make the work, how I need to honor the stories, because bringing this work into this gallery, I'm bringing these people's stories and their lives in as well, and they need to be treated with a great deal of respect.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I guess when I'm talking about land, my connection to land and my work, like I said, I didn't have any of these stories in my family history growing up about my ancestors. So my work is largely about speculation and going to these places that my ancestry, but done DNA tests or where I knew where they were living, and I go there to walk in their footsteps and just try to see what I can take or feel, just recreate anything just by putting my hand in the soil, by taking goldenrod, like the first time I went to Kentucky. The small, in this piece I didn't talk about when I was over there, but the smaller plant life there, it's goldenrod, which is the Kentucky state flower. When I went there, for the first time when my family was enslaved, I took a bunch of it where my family was enslaved. Like everything was like, looks like it's in the countryside. It feels so beautiful, but it's just, how could it be that beautiful? Because it's just so ugly. But I wanted to take some of it with me. And I don't know, like the land is all I have in terms of my ancestry. I have a massive soil collection. That piece is made from soil. And the reason this soil is so much more, I think, important maybe than the soil I've collected from Africa or Kentucky and Chicago is the fact that this was the future. This represents the future for my family and hope. Like everyone had the American dream, my family, every group who comes here has that so-called American dream, whatever that is. And this was freedom, like this is actually for my dad's side of the family, but we have this like random plot of land in Central California, like 5 acres. And my dad bought that in the 60s so he could have this. It's like he came from Kentucky, like my mom's family came from Kentucky to Chicago, and then California bought that because there was just always a searching for more. Like, it's almost like, okay, I'm free, I'm in Chicago, okay, but what's next, you know? And this is just representing, like, I purchased this myself. This is California, it's like this as far as you can go, I guess, in this country west, and this whole sense of curiosity, and my family just never got done with that search. And so I have a massive soil collection, and I think for me, that soil from California is the most important for me to, and I don't own it, I don't look at it as like we own that property, we're just caretakers of it, you know, but it's important to be on it and to step on it.
I just wanted to say, I think it's so interesting, Trina and I didn't discover this following you for a while, but we both collected dirt.
That's what I was.
We have this massive soil collection, and we've talked on our many days in the hate at this bar that will remain unnamed. That's very cool. About our soil collections and about the discomfort of should I hold on to this? I feel like maybe the earth I've collected needs to return home. And how do I grapple with that? And I love that we're both grappling with that in this.
That's why, yeah, because we've been talking for a while, and we gotta be in a show together, so thank you, Zoe. We've been talking about our soil collections, everything, and then we were talking about, should I keep this, should I return it? When I was in Senegal, I went to Gorée Island, which there is, it's not, Todd House was supposed to talk about this recently. There is a bit of debate in terms of that slave fortress, you know, like how many enslaved people were there and what it was, the history of what it was used for. But we did go there, and there's this room where they said that's where there were enslaved children held. And I took a jar and I collected some of the soil from that floor. Now that soil I know has to be returned. That is not mine, and I feel it is not meant for me to own. I mean, I can't touch it. I will not do anything with it. I will only take it back. And that I love that you brought that up.
I think, sorry, just say more, but I just think
Matt and I are happy to just sit on the
the weight of these stories I've told my friends, and I had so many. I mean, Adrian and Chauncey came into my home so much as I was making this piece, and you came over and gave advice, and you could feel the heaviness in my home. I live in a very small studio apartment, but it was thick, and as soon as everything, the piece left and came here, I was like, whoa, like we've been here together. And I think these pieces are loaded and hold so much. They're like living histories and their lives.
Yeah, I was just going to note really quickly that it was one of the things that stood out to me in the conversations that we had independently with Tricia and Trina, the heaviness of the burden of doing this work that carries stories that are at once yours, but I could feel a tension in our conversations with both of you, that there was at least this questioning or reckoning with what to do with a story that is mine but not fully mine. And we talked about it with the soil, we talked about it with these stories, and I think for those of us who come to museums from time to time and have the benefit, right, of seeing this work and reading the notes and learning the history, I don't often think about that burden, that tension, that reckoning that is so clear and palpable when you two talk about your own practices. You've already given us a window into that, but Trina, I mean, this story that you're telling is so, it feels to the outsider, it's so your story. I mean, this is a story about your great-great-great-grandfather, an enslaved person. Can you just tell us about the tension and the sort of burden that you feel telling his story and telling the story of his wife and their children?
So, yeah, I sometimes, I don't know, that's a really hard question. No, you're great. No, that's a great, no, but that needs to be asked, and I appreciate that. Sometimes I was really not guilty, I didn't ask permission from my mom to do this, to tell these stories, to do this work. And she hasn't actually, when I've been in the midst of my art practice, especially where it is now, the pandemic has been happening and she's not comfortable traveling, so she's just seen film, she's never seen this, like that print piece or some of my other print pieces, anything with my hand. I've sent her some things, but she hasn't seen anything like this in person, and I feel like sometimes there's a problem, not a problem, I feel like there is permission sometimes I should have been asking that I might maybe not have, in terms of if my family wants all these stories told. Especially in the beginning, I was very unsure. My mom is very happy, she says, very happy that I'm telling these stories, but at first she was uncomfortable with me talking about, and a lot of, I think, people of African descent or people from marginalized communities don't want to talk about these kind of stories because, they are, they're because of the pain. But I think Martin and my ancestors and my living ancestors, like my mother, now my mom's definitely happy because it shows how far we've come and that we're living with them. We're here because of them. And I know that, all that he did, all Martin did, like he ended up purchasing his wife and some of his children, his second wife and some of his children. And then it's, I don't know, I think that he'd be very grateful that that he's being acknowledged and he's seen, that he feels very seen in history that's being finally told, as opposed to being erased, because it was completely erased.
Thank you. Yeah, I should shout out your moth story. You have this incredible family story that's detailed in moth radio. But there's a line in your mock radio that was so poetic, and it really describes both your relationship to objects, not as things, but as entities or carriers or vessels. But you were saying you're staring at, a record of sale, was it? And saying, like, I am holding the souls of my ancestors in my hand. And it resonated with another line from another interview that I will shout out with artist awesome Emily Wilson, featuring Tricia Rainwater.
Art is Awesome is the podcast, and Tricia was recently on it.
Yeah.
And it's a damn good episode.
It's a good episode. You should listen to it. And I really loved in our studio visit where, you're making these monumental objects in your home.
Yeah.
Right? And each of these are bloodlines and threads, and each ribbon represents a person. You said, my apartment was alive when I was making these things. And so, with that, I wanted to ask you, Tricia, if you would tell a story that you told us about, I wanted to get at this about your photography, because you're telling us a story about when you were in a gallery at, yeah, it shall not be named, but you were at a gallery and you had an interesting conversation with someone who found a problem with your photographs, right? So can you talk about that story a little bit?
Happy to. I feel like everybody's heard the story. I've been photographing for a long time. I think I said I've been making self-portraits for 10 years, but I think it's longer. I think it's more like 14. And I went through a program in the city for Indigenous artists, and I pitched an idea that I wanted to gain the rights to copies of photographs at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, of Native people the day they got to boarding school, and then a year later, because these photos were taken to prove that it was working, this idea of colonizing. And I also, side note, at the front of every boarding school there was a sign or painted, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And so this was truly the idea and the way that these boarding schools worked, horrific. So I started to make work with this, and the gallery told me that the work was not personal enough. This wasn't my family. I couldn't find my family's records. So what did this have to do with me? And so I thought, okay, I'm going to make 100 portraits of myself nude in a school in San Francisco in the positions of my childhood abuse. And I took them back and I showed them, and I was so proud. I was like, here you go. Like, these are really great. Look, I'm amazing. And they hated them. The gallerist told me that my body had gotten in the way of the message. And I was telling that, Hakeem, when you came in my home, and I was showing you that I think these works would be accepted more now. That so much has happened since then. They were shown in 4 shows in San Francisco, always in a back room, always hidden. And so when Zoe and I were speaking, I was like, I want to be in front. I want to be centered. I don't want the story to be hidden. And so every gallery I speak to now, I'm very clear that the work needs to be very insight. And so my self-portrait work as well, I tend to make it very large. As a native, fat, queer in the Bay with little visibility, I get to own your gaze in the gallery. And so I want my pieces to overwhelm you and to hold space and to be confronting.
Yeah, I love that you said you wanted the control. You wanted agency, control over the voyeuristic gaze. But I think for him, like the issue when I heard the story was that this was a photograph where they said you're too literal and you're too central. Why is that? And I said, portraiture has been a long time genre. Why is your centrality all of a sudden an issue? And I think about to historicize the radicality of your work is that centering grades against so many different photographic traditions in which Native bodies were central in different ways. They were central as ethnographic subjects, or they were centralized, they were centralized as an ethnographic subject. And so I think that there's in many ways in which you're intervening not only on landscapes, but on conceptions of what is rendered visible and what is a valid body in portraiture. Right?
Yes, it makes the art folks in the room feel any better. It's not just an art that people who look like the 4 of us on stage are marginalized. I mean, it's noteworthy, right? Maybe not at ICA San Jose, but it's noteworthy in the many art places I go in the Bay. The 4 of us who look the way that we do are on this stage. And I just want to know there's not just an art where this kind of marginalization or the treatment of marginalized people as mere objects of some dominant group's affection or their disdain or their wanderings. That's typical in the academic world too, where some of us hang out. We've got some friends from academic world in the audience. It's typical, it really is typical to center the white gaze, to center some dominant group in the telling of stories. And so I just wanted to note that this is radical in its own, I think, right, that you both have chosen. I always screw up this Toni Morrison line where she says, I just stood in the center and claimed it, right? It stood in the center and claimed it. And that's what these works do as I see them, and sort of recovering, or at least insisting on the humanity of the subjects whose stories you're documenting in these pieces. I mean, Tricia, you really forced us to look upon a wall of missing women, and there is no way to see the beautiful mobiles on either side without looking at these women's faces. And Trina's piece, as you all go up and see it closely, Trina has redacted by way of threading every word that doesn't acknowledge the humanity of her ancestors, such that the only words that remain, William, man, free. And so even as we sort of tell these really, I think, hard stories, there's something that both of you have done, in my seeing at least, that you insisted on the humanity of those who are often rendered invisible and marginal. And I think that's pretty fucking radical. And it's particularly radical, I think, in institutions like museums or universities. And so the radicality is one piece that really stands out in my seeing of these pieces. It's kind of a radical act that we're all forced to look at these people in this way. So thank you.
Yeah, and so another major intervention and strategy I see between both is, when history doesn't give you an archive, what archives do you use? Where can you find your family and your friends? And so, did you want to talk about your relationship? Well, first, like, would be Tricia. I know I've been like asking you all the questions, but what kinds of archives do you work through, find life in, or want to correct?
I think that my work is confronting the fact that I don't have an archive because my relationship to my family has been really cut off due to a lot of deep trauma and abuse. There are ways that we have lost each other on purpose as a way to not harm each other anymore. And so I go to records. This work was, I will say, this work was really made possible by Anita Lucchese, who runs Sovereign Bodies Institute, which is the first institute that has started to track Native women and femmes who go missing. There's no documentation of that online. And the FBI, the government, has not been tracking that. And so it took a Native organization to do that, which is horrific, again. But I look to, my work really looks to make my own archive, and I think I'm grappling with that as a woman in her 40s now. I don't know if I'll have children, and who will my archive be left to? What reasons does it matter if there's no child to leave it to or no family? And I think I'm revisiting my reasons for making an archive now, and my reasons for wanting to make people look at things. They're beyond that.
For me, the archive, very similar. It's like I don't have a lot of things, in terms of my, that are passed down, so I'm just like constantly either creating my own archive. I have like this in my soil collection, the different grasses and materials and plant life that I've collected and put up in little jars and such. I've traveled all over the country. Kentucky, I remember the first time I went to the University of Kentucky at Lexington's archive, because the people who enslaved my family, their main archive is at that school, and they're a special collections department. So the first time I remember I went, they had all these folders, as a massive collection. I had one day there, so I went to the folder that was called slaves. I think there were like a few of them. But I think I found only one document that had an ancestor that I was directly connected to, the people I knew of. So I only had one day, so I went back for 4 days a couple of years later. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna look up every, things about their lives, to see, folders that had details about their property, or letters, family letters, and that's where I found everything. Just writing letters. One of my favorite letters was from one of the enslavers, his wife, to him, saying, I hope if you want to sell so-and-so, go ahead. She's something like, she keeps talking back to me, and I was like, good, she's showing her agency. I'm glad she's causing trouble. She is, and she's not even causing trouble. She's just stepping up and showing her humanity to this woman. And I loved it. I'm like, I wish I knew her. And that was one of my most treasured moments. Another treasured moment I had was when, in that same trip, there was a folder for wills. It was that will. I found out there was a folder for revisions of it. So earlier revisions of the final copy of that will. And it had, so here it just says, the man Martin, he was freed in 1856, and Charlotte and Nancy. It was line by line when the year they're going to be freed. This particular archive, this particular version of it, it was written completely different. They were in family groups. So I was able to actually identify my 4 times great grandmother Nancy, who I've talked about before, but I got to see that she was literally the mom. She's been in so many documents, but it looks like she was Martin's mom. And I was like the first time I actually, she would have been born around 1780s. And so she would have been there at Fort Boonesboro with Daniel Boone. And so just to know that my family has been that deeply erased, my family was there at a horrible, horrific time, was a witness to all the atrocities, because we've been like uplifting Daniel Boone to be this like wonderful man, and all the erasure that's been going on in terms of like the actual story, what happened with Daniel Boone. But then also the Black people who were there, who were building everything and setting up these forts. And there weren't that many of us, but it's the fact that like I was very grateful to know that I now was able to use this archive to identify her, and now trying to tell her story, again through speculation, but try to create a world, do some world building with her to let people know that she was there taking care and building this whole space.
Yeah, and Trina's studio, this remarkable place across the street from the Minnesota Street Project. Trina has, and there's so many pieces that as a scholar of race and identity and Black politics, it's just so striking. I mean, you go in and in Trina's office, she has a piece, a leaflet from the Emancipator.
The Appeal.
The Appeal. I'm thinking of a different abolitionist magazine. The Appeal, and in this bit of this leaflet, it's a documenting of these free Black folk, and there was a documenting of what they were wearing to the social gatherings that they were going to, and so there was this record keeping among these high society Black folk who were caterers and that sort of thing. And you read through this and you see that Miss So-and-so was wearing a cream-colored, blouse with a red pant, and then alongside that, you have these documents about your enslaved ancestors, this sort of diversity of the Black experience that has long been a part of telling that story, with all of its beauty and all of its trauma. We can't recommend this Moth episode enough to you, where you can also learn about Trina having to haggle with an auction house to get these documents, these wills that told the story of her enslaved ancestors being bought and sold, and Trina having to haggle to get those documents. That's just a plug to really go home and listen. We don't have time tonight because we want to invite you to ask some questions too, but you should really go home and listen to Trina tell that story in detail.
Trina, while we're on that topic, did you want to talk about that series? Was it the Imagine Family Heirlooms series?
Yeah, so the Imagine Family Heirlooms is from that that's the series that he's referencing. So what it is, because like I said, my work is dealing a lot with speculation. So what I did is I have on my own handmade paper. It's 70% palm leaves that I brought back from Cameroon, 30% cotton from that black one from North Carolina. So I made that paper, and then I photographed different objects that I imagine belong to my family. Because like I said, we don't have anything from that time, so it's Imagine Family Heirlooms. And one of the pieces that you were mentioning, was referenced in that newspaper, The Appeal. It was a black ostrich fan, and it's taken from that newspaper because there was a line in there. And at this party, they were talking about, which like my great-great-grandfather's brother hosted in Chicago in 1889, and PBS Pinchback, from Louisiana was there. This was like a real party, and he was born enslaved. He was like 4 or 5, when he was free. But pretty much everybody at this party was born enslaved, and this is in Chicago because these were all like older, they're in their 50s, 60s, whatever. And that there was a line where it said "Black Ostrich Tips," and I just was like, I got to go find a black fancy ostrich fan, and I found one from like the 1870s from an auction from an antique place. And so everything in there is just what I imagined. There's 4 prints. It's going to be a larger series, and I'm going to make a piece that's going to be like a composite, like a much larger piece, a composite of the dresses mentioned in that article. But yeah, it's everything is every title is taken directly from an archival document. So the one is called, there's like a knife, and one is called Nancy, a girl. And it's when Nancy, it's the will where Nancy's mentioned when she has been freed. It's called Nancy, a Girl, 1790. So it's from a will that the person who owned her, but when he was referencing her, you know, when he died, you know, where she, you know, how old she was and whatever. And like, yeah, so this is how I'm dealing with the archive in that way. Like, how do I tell, I was asking Matt, like how, because I'm like a curator's nightmare, I think, because I'm also like trying to tell these stories, processing them visually, but I also want them documented. I want the stories written down and documented so they're not lost again for real. Like, I want every word. So I was talking to one of my teachers, Angela Hennessy at CCA, and like, how do I incorporate, because I don't want to annoy curators, like having all of this text, you know, whatever. And she was like, well, do what Kara Walker's doing, you know, get those long titles, like put it all in there. So from that series, like some of the titles are really long. But I want people to know.
Oh, I just love that one because my love is a respectability scholar, and so much.
I don't practice it. I don't practice it.
Yeah.
But
we think about respectability. But what was striking is that you know, sometimes you can only find your ancestors in these estate inventories, and so they're literally you can only find them in object records. And so what's striking about this project that these were deep portraits of Black agency in which they were willingly in the appeal reversing this rhetoric of like who gets to be called an object in the kind of class dynamics. And like if I were to portraitize myself as an object, it would be an ostrich feather, and that's glamour, that's dignity.
Yeah, this sort of insistence, and we should wrap our portion up to let folks get in, but this insistence on dignity that both of you are talking about. Sorry,
yeah, so this is like my last kind of theoretical question before we open up to the floor. So Tricia, your work is really profound because I've been really thinking a lot about the politics of naming, like either naming a violence or naming a person or naming oneself willingly. And again, this is like a poem or a fragment of a poem by Natalie Diaz, who I mentioned, the Mojave poet, at the top of the conversation, where she really explicitly talks about naming. And so I'm just going to read a couple lines and then turn that question over to you. But she writes, the first violence against any body of water is to forget the name its creator first called it. Worse, forget the bodies who spoke that name. And when I read the word body here, like I think a lot about Oceanic cosmology, and water is not just like a thing or a resource. It is a synonym for universe or life giver. And so I just wanted, it was a striking strategy since Martin, naming Martin or Trina, and naming the women in your work, Tricia. So this is a broader question about naming and language and its relationship to the land.
So I worked with Dr. Sarah Witt, who is a Choctaw scholar, and shout out to her, she was a really great help. And she's been helping me with language over the past few years as I started to work with language on naming my pieces. And I have a piece that was shown at Root Division last year, where I learned to say in Choctaw, "Grandmother, you deserve healing," and then "I deserve healing." And the video is looped. I say it 100 times, and it was projected over medicine. Really, I think naming that my grandmother was trafficked the same way I was trafficked, that this has been a pattern that I will break, I think naming our harm is very powerful and very hard. Hard feels like not a strong enough word, but it separates us often from community, and it can alienate us. But I think it's very important. And I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I will say it anyways. I just also, I think with all the turmoil happening in this country right now, I think it's really important to learn about Indigenous issues, and I just wanted to put in a plug for that. I think everyone should go home and research man camps and what they are and what they do. But I think naming our trauma, naming our harms is really important, and I think language being used to call back the women and femmes on this wall is really powerful, and it's really, really heavy medicine.
For me, and I've had this conversation with people, and I understand when they say to me, "Oh, there's no way I could go and look up my," I don't want to know about that part of my family's history in terms of the history of enslavement. It's just, it's great that you want to do that, but like, I can't do that, and I get that, I respect that, because it's painful. And going through all these documents, looking at each one, when I see how they were enslaved, especially the first one I ever saw was their names next to a dollar sign. I mean, that was just, I didn't understand. I'm African American, and I did not fully understand slavery until I literally saw my ancestor's name next to a dollar sign. But I find it incredibly important to name them, to find out that you have, for me, it's important to do this research and to name them and keep saying their names over and over again. And all these buildings, these places, these plantations, where people are having their weddings and all this stuff, everyone who was enslaved and all that, there's got to be a spot where everyone is named. Like, it's important, because the moment I started finding and seeing my ancestors' names and knowing who they were, like, they actually were people. Slavery is taught in this country that it's just this deep, dark moment, and we only should know about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and like a few people, but like, just be quiet about the rest. Like, the moment I felt so liberated, my life changed. I switched careers. I was working in tech and making a lot of money. I want to turn the way we talk about marginalized people, especially the history of enslavement, on its head, and say these names and scream them out loud, because they were survivors. I wouldn't be here without them. We need to change how we talk about people in this country. And that's why it's important, I think, why the naming and names, especially for this piece, is just so important, because that's how you see people's humanity. I look at myself completely different now that I know my ancestors' names, because I actually have a history now. And they try to take it from me, and I'm not going to let that happen again.
As you all were talking about naming, I was just reminded of a feminist scholar who said, to name the problem is often to become the problem. And at a moment where history is just so contested, political elites and others are really trying to not let us learn these histories, I'm reminded in this moment that to name the problem is often, in the eyes of some, to become the problem, which is why it's such radical work to do what you all are doing. I think with Zoe's indulgence and yours, we can take a couple of questions from the audience. I can do. Thank you, Zoe.
I work here, so I'm going to ask for the privilege of, I'm sorry, I don't have a question. I wanted to be able to say just a couple of things if I can. I really want to thank Trina and Tricia for being here. Trina, we've known each other for a while. Tricia, we've really only been introduced thanks to Zoe and through this and through your work, and it has been transformational for me, and it's been an extraordinary experience. With that, if I can, I'd like to pay tribute to the staff for just a moment, and I'd like to call out Ruby Medina, who I work with, and also in a lot of ways, we just don't always know each other, but also there are elements to Tricia's work that has drawn forward elements of Ruby Medina's life and being, and she speaks so very highly of you, and I do hope that somehow you all will have an opportunity to speak this evening. I also want to shout out to staff in terms of like Sam and Zoe, and with Trina talking about the soil and the labor of love that's often put into this, often by people who, albeit a fallacy, could be described as white, the work and labor of love that it takes, where indeed Zoe and Sam together drove to Fresno and brought all this soil out here and packed it down. And we were in this space watching that labor happen of the work coming together, which was something truly spectacular. I grew up right on the Mason-Dixon line, so there was a lot about the experience of African Americans that had informed my life. I did not know much about indigenous culture until I was growing up, and most especially once I started into my work, and I had the great good fortune of meeting an artist named Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who totally opened my eyes to so much of the indigenous experience in this country. And then also just hearing this talk this evening really makes me understand again like the importance of the work that we're doing to teach, to share these stories. So also with that, thank you for trusting us in doing that. And then if I can, just lastly, would want to mention, because you were encouraging, please learn more. And I just learned the other day, seeing some of the work, it's up in Fort Mason right now, produced by Koto Ozawa, but also working very closely with a filmmaker who's just produced a documentary called Sugarcane, which is very, very accessible and just been released on Hulu, and you can go right home and watch it if you'd like to, or anything through the National Geographic Channel. And I may be misspeaking, and maybe you're not in any way attuned to the work, but it's a powerful piece of work and gives further opportunities to just sort of keep learning. And I hope that was all okay, and it's so lovely to have you all here. I just wanted to be able to share some of those thoughts. Thank you all so, so much.
Any other questions? Thank you, first of all, for being very vulnerable tonight and sharing all the really personal stories with us. I know it takes a lot to do so. One thing that really struck me when we both were talking throughout the night is that both stories carry a lot of like violent history of colonial violence with it, and kind of working through that through your personal stories and also through histories that you might be sort of rediscovering and also unpacking and working through it. And one thing that I was wondering about was, how is this also healing to both of you personally, and also maybe possibly your ancestors and future generations to come, of like, what are you hoping to sort of get out of it, and also how was the healing process when it came to this?
No, thank you for that question. I look at my art practice as a somatic process. This whole piece is, because it's focused on materiality and the labor that I put into it. There's a lot, especially with the pedestal made from the soil. It's not just like some random idea to do rammed earth. I mean, it dates back to West African, or there's traditions throughout the country, or throughout the world, but West African traditions in terms of building with earth. And this is just adding a little bit of concrete to it to make it a little bit more stable. But there are traditions of using clay and soil and different materials to make a structure out, especially homes, out of soil. So putting that together when we're doing the ramming of it here, it was just like that force. I just felt like everything was just it was connecting to the earth, but also just like releasing everything that I've been told, like this wasn't ours, like this history isn't mine. And then especially with the planting, it's like over 400 pieces. My back is still like recovering, but I wanted to do that completely myself. I planted the goldenrod, like I said before, is tucked, kind of to represent like the hidden histories. And then the pampas grass is very ornate, and it's I wanted to kind of have this dreamlike feel. You can see native grass, you can see pampas. It's an invasive, but it's quite lovely and dreamy, and you can see it all up and down the coast of California, especially where I live right now in Bernal Heights. I'm just loving that I'm surrounded by it right now. But the labor, like planting each one of those, was a release. I insisted I had to do it myself. I had to plant each one, like it was the moving it forward, like planting the goldenrod, but then moving the pampas grass was like moving forward and finding how they each fit in this wonderful puzzle. And I just really do feel I had to do that. So it was very healing.
Yeah, the work was super involved. I was very connected to community, including Chantal, who asked that lovely question. The work was quite painful. I think that in a lot of Indigenous communities, we don't talk about when our loved ones go missing. It can be quite quiet. When my friend went missing a few years ago, I felt this anger in my throat. I wanted to post on Instagram, and I wanted to and there was nothing I could do. And I've been grappling with how I would process that. And yeah, it was like a very somatic experience. Ripping the ribbons and having friends and community come into my home and help me. I was really behind on the project, and I was working my day job and then working another night job making the work. And my dog, who's an elder dog, was like, "What the hell is happening here?" The apartment was covered, and I remember Trina came over and she was like, "You got a long way to go." I was in the most encouraging way. But the work was quite painful, and really, I think week after week taking it to therapy with my therapist, and she's like, "How are you feeling?" I was like, but really a somatic process, and really a process where I was able to have community come in, and we were able to process some of the things, these worries that we will become a statistic, these concerns that it could be us next, and how do we keep each other safe. So those things are brought to the surface.
Any last questions?
Both of your stories are so powerful, so meaningful. And then there are those of us who have been on the other side, who have a different ancestry. And we see what's happening in our country today in terms of not wanting to hear the stories, not wanting to accept the damage that has been done to Black Americans, to Indigenous Americans. What are your suggestions in terms of bringing this forward so that there's more understanding and more acceptance among those that are not hearing it and not seeing it and are rejecting it?
What a hard question. I think a lot of people are doing a lot of good work in hard places, and I've been talking a lot with colleagues about this question. How does one get through hard moments like this? And my students often ask this question in a large lecture class that I teach on American politics and public policy at Stanford, and we go through all of this traumatic stuff because the history is laden with it. And students inevitably ask, because it's a good question that deserves an answer, and it's this question of, "Professor, where do you find hope? Are you optimistic? Should we be optimistic?" I don't know the answer to that, but I tell them that, and it sounds a little cheesy, but it's true. For me, the optimism rests in the fact that every day, even in what seem to be good times for us, they're really hard times for lots of people. And every day, there's somebody who's getting up, putting on their shoes, and going out, doing hard stuff to change hard realities. And so I think a lot about, women who've been working for reproductive rights across the American South for a long time, even before Roe v. Wade was overturned. You know, black folks who were facing all manner of oppression, who were getting up, doing hard work. And so I think for me the answer is to join people who have long been doing really hard work and hard ass places. Like for I think some of us and the places where we reside, you know, we live in Palo Alto, life in seemingly good times is good, but it's really hard all the time for lots of people, and they get up every day and do hard shit. And so I've been telling my students, go find an organization where people, a local organization, where people are already doing the hard work of justice, and ask, how can I help? And I think that's my advice. It's like find people doing hard work and say, how can I join forces with you? Not how can I create something anew, but how can I join the efforts that have likely been there for a long time?
And land back. Land back. Land back. Period. Turn it back over. Land back.
Thank you all so much. What an incredible talk. I just want to also add to that there's a quote that Amanda Gorman puts at the beginning of her book by Anne Carson, saying that history and elegy are akin, that if you inquire about the weight, the texture, the history, the qualities of life, you are a historian. And when you dive into these histories, you learn that you also carry that, or you ashpin it into something that can carry itself. And it is such a goal of the work that you both present, that we are all historians. That's the kind of hope from my exhibition as well, is to prompt us to all to question these narratives, look into our own archives, make new archives that aren't there, and become our own historians during a kind of challenging and very traumatic time period right now. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.